Hi, folks. Welcome to the very first day of content in the second section of Decolonial Narratives. As we mentioned previously, we are going to be examining the contemporary Black experience through the series of systems that have perpetuated um, racism, specifically American racism. And we're going to unpack this through a series of narratives, but also through the texts that I've asked you to order, which hopefully are either on their way or you're kind of active in procuring them. I want to start our class with a story, and then from there, um, I'm going to go over some basic elements, but I did create a series of PowerPoints, and obviously you have the readings to kind of get you started. The story begins with me growing up in public housing in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore is a very Black city in its nature. It's 75% Black out of the 700,000 people that live there. And the public housing in Baltimore was almost entirely Black. Um, my mom was the victim of domestic violence, and she didn't have any money. She couldn't hold a job because her second husband um, was stalking us. And as a result, she kept losing her job because of the stalking that was unfortunately allowed to occur in 80s and 90s America. We did not have good domestic violence laws at that point. So my mom had to apply for public housing. It was the only way to afford a life. And so I was living in this very poor community, and it was entirely Black and brown. In fact, I don't know if there were any white folks that I remember on my block for sure, maybe in the neighborhood somewhere. During this time, this is my high school years, I had a good friend who I danced with. Many of you probably remember that I was a hip hop dancer, which is how I got into college. One of my co dancers, Leon, um, was an amazing student. He was, we're talking the very beginning of our senior year, he was gauged to be salutatorian. Um, he was incredibly bright, but not just bright. He was also really thoughtful and philosophical. In fact, it was Leon who exposed me to thinkers that eventually become really important in my life later. He introduced me to Friedrich Nietzsche, to Karl Marx, and this is in high school. He read these for fun. He thought a lot about power relations and ideas kind of surrounding the ascent of power, particularly in a capitalist environment. Leon also smoked pot sometimes. His father did, and his mother and father were both part of the Black Panther movement in the 60s and 70s. And while Leon was obviously a very good student, um, incredibly bright, it was illegal to possess marijuana at that time and certainly to smoke it. But of course, most people did. Let's keep that in mind. One day, Leon was coming back from practice. I was not with him on this occasion. He was with his sister and his sister's boyfriend. And cops busted him. He had somewhere between a 16th and an eighth of an ounce of swag. This was, of course, a misdemeanor in Maryland, in Baltimore of the 90s. But then, interestingly enough, the prosecutors actually went after Leon for intent to distribute, which was a felony. Now, between a 16th and an eighth of an ounce, if you are familiar at all with marijuana quantities, you are not selling with that amount of pot. But this is the time of the war on drugs. And there were very steep rules, very steep prosecution protocols. And Leon was found guilty for intent to distribute. Now, because he was a minor, his jail time was shortened. However, he was not able to graduate. Because he had a felony on his record, he could not apply to college. Because now he had a felony, he could not get a job. And that's the beginning of the story. Leon's story is what greatly inspires me to teach this section of decolonial narratives that I designed around the Black American experience. I think that it is a story that in some ways we know, but then in other ways we don't. Leon is one of many people in the Black community who has been at the tail end of a racist system that has further perpetuated the lack of social mobility for a community that on paper is deemed equal to others in American society. But what we are going to do this quarter is understand how that is a gross overrepresentation of a community that is still dealing not only with implied racist systemic ideals, but ones of law. Race is the child of racism, not the father. That is a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who actually also grew up in Baltimore and has written quite a few really profound texts on the Black body in particular. I recommend Between the World and Me. Again, he says, race is the child of racism, not the father. And that is because race doesn't really exist. It is merely a creation by societies for the aims of certain kinds of social and economic purposes. I want to leave it at that, and we'll come back to that in a bit. The definition of racism that we are going to be looking at in this class, even though, of course, we have talked about it in various ways last quarter, is a structure or system of oppression that occurs when a group's ideologically born prejudice is backed by legal authority and institutional control, which then becomes a default of the society and reproduced automatically, so that it is indeed law and institution that first enables the ideology to form. So ideology begets law, law begets ideology. Kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. And the kind of racism that exists in America, at least in its history, is founded in race science, which was driven by social and economic interests. And this has a lot to do with Darwin's On the Origin of Species. And we will talk about that more later in the quarter. There are many social forces that hold racial hierarchy in place, born out of this idea of race science from the 19th century. But it's the ideology of individualism, objectivity, and meritocracy largely. First off, individualism. We are each unique and we stand apart from others, even within our social groups, making our identities irrelevant to our opportunities. This is a resistance to generalization. This is individualism. And in many cases, we really value individualism in our culture. I mean, I certainly do. And again, remember that all institutions have a light and a dark. We always have to remember that there is a complexity here. And so while we can certainly celebrate individualism, we can almost begin to understand how it could potentially contribute, along with other factors, to a system that would embrace racism. Objectivity as a social force. Now, this is interesting, right? Because don't we value ourselves on being able to be objective when observing phenomenon? Objectivity is ideal, even possible, to be free of all bias. We can see the world from a universal human perspective as opposed to one from the perspective of a particular kind of human, right? And then lastly, the social force of meritocracy. This idea that any individual can succeed if they work hard. Kind of the pull up by your bootstraps argument that maybe we've heard in the past. Interestingly enough, these three values, which in many ways have terrific virtue, are three of the largest contributors as to why in America and many other places around the world, but we're going to focus on American racism, why in America there is still a racial hierarchy in place, despite the fact that by law, all people are created equal. There are other social forces that hold racial hierarchy in place. One that we've talked about when referring to the indigenous, narrow and repetitive media representations of people of color, or all people for that matter, yes, but particularly people of color. Another is segregation in schools and neighborhoods, which might not be able to be done by law anymore, but certainly is practiced mass popula. Depictions of whiteness as the human ideal. We're going to explore that more in this class. Truncated history, where we leave out entire aspects of historical developments that could illuminate how the Black community has somehow continued to be sequestered in terms of opportunity. Jokes, warnings, taboos on openly talking about race. And then certainly, and still to this day, and we know we have seen it lately, white solidarity. When you are accustomed to privilege, equality can feel like oppression. And there is a lot of white solidarity around the feeling of being oppressed in the age of a time when we are diligently trying to seek a sense of equity in our culture. And we have seen a lot of this white solidarity emerge, especially after the election of Donald Trump. So one of the things that we need to do in order to begin to examine the contemporary Black experience and how it has ended up in the place that it is currently is we have to look at the history of America as a Black nation, which has been since its very beginning. So I've asked you to read a whole series of chapters from White Fragility, Color of Law for this week to begin to get a somewhat comprehensive and an abridged history at the same time. But what you are going to be reading about are the Great Migrations, the first and the second. You're going to be reading about the proliferation of covenants that existed based on the Supreme Court decision Buchanan versus Worley. We're going to be looking at zoning discrimination, a concept called redlining, and predatory lending. We're actually going to be looking a lot at housing and how housing was disseminated for quite a long time, but especially after the emancipation of the Black community and the subsequent Jim Crow laws. But of course, these housing covenants, these housing laws, go well up into the 90s and the 2000s. But we want to look at their historical foundation and then begin to understand how long and difficult it took to erase them from the books. Okay? For this lecture, though, I just want to talk about the first Great Migration. This is roughly between 1916 and 1940. Okay? 1.6 million Black Americans moved from the South, where they had been primarily congregated, obviously. That was the places where slavery was allowed. And after emancipation in the mid to late 19th century, most Black folks couldn't afford to move. So they wound up settling in the areas where their families and themselves were formerly slaves. A lot of them had to establish themselves in the new economic model of sharecropping, right? Or other forms of indentured servitude where, of course, they were no longer property, but they were fiscally bound quite often to the same exact people that they had been slaves to formerly. So there wasn't a lot of mobility for an economically depressed community that went from being property to being free agents, but of course owning no property and having no money. So it took quite a bit of time for there even to be this ability to mobilize post-emancipation. And in fact, 2 to 3 generations before there was ever a sense of mobility. So between 1916 and 1940, 1.6 million Black folks that presumably felt mobilized enough moved to a lot of northern cities. This was at also the height of industrialization. And it was at the moment where America's factories were gangbusters, right? Particularly between World War I and World War II. And a lot of those factories were in the north. The jobs were there. And so a lot of Blacks living in the South moved to where the jobs were. Obviously, it was also to escape Jim Crow. And many of you know that history about the oppressive laws that were immediately established, mostly in the South, to maintain some sense of the economic model that had been lost in the South as a result of emancipation and no longer having free labor. Okay. What I would like you to do, in addition to obviously reading the material for this week, and there is quite a bit, so please make some time for it, I'd love for you to look at my PowerPoint called Racism and the Great Migration, so that you can begin to become familiar with some of the terminology that I don't want to express in this lecture because it's better to see visual. But to know some of the anchoring ideas and concepts that were prevalent in American society and how it affected the Black community in particular. So, get to reading and definitely start looking at those discussion questions and the PowerPoint titled Week 1, Racism and the Great Migration. We start doing that. We start becoming familiar with some of these concepts. And then in my lecture on Thursday, I'm going to go a little bit further in depth about the effects of the Great Migrations and some of the ideas that came about as a result of the influx of Black folks living in areas besides the South. Have a good couple days. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email and I'll talk with you soon.